Hello everyone and welcome to Oriana Unlock. I am Oriana and on this channel we are going to be diving deep in order to unlock new knowledge about topics that truly matter. And today we're going to be unlocking new knowledge with a person that is literally building the future of spaceflight and space research in Europe. She worked at the DLR, which is Germany's Aerospace Center. She was also a top-tier strategist for the European Space Agency, and she also made history by being nominated the first president of Portugal's space agency, Portugal Space. Right now, she's balancing between two very interesting worlds. She is a professor of space propulsion and mobility at the Technical University of Munich, TUM, and she is also the COO of a very interesting startup project called Aerospace, which uses artificial intelligence to prevent collisions in sort of the orbital highways of space. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming our very, very special guest for today, Professor Chiara Manfletti. Professor Manfletti, thank you so much for being here with us today. It is truly a privilege and an honor to have you here in Oriana Unlocked to start unlocking this sort of knowledge on space and the future of space. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. The pleasure is all mine, and I look forward to what our discussion is all going to be about.
Professor Manfletti, you have done groundbreaking research on laser ignition for cryogenic engines. For a 16-year-old who thinks of igniting a rocket like a giant matchstick, how does using laser change the game for reliability and reusability in space?
Well, of course, in order to ignite a propulsion system, you obviously need an ignition system. And if you want to have higher reliability, if you want to have a higher number of uses, then of course having also an ignition system which allows you to reignite multiple times and to do so reliably is necessary, right? And you just mentioned a giant matchstick, right? That is not very reusable. So laser ignition is one of those technologies that we were looking at when I was working at the German Aerospace Center to see whether we could indeed increase the number of reignitions for so-called cryogenic engines. So engines that use cryogenic propellants, which are very, very cold. So like liquid oxygen, hydrogen, methane, and such. But also requiring a lower amount of energy and having a higher ignition probability. So laser ignition fundamentally is one of those enabling technologies for a high number of reignitions with also so-called green propellants which are less toxic than some things which have been used in the past and are still being used a little bit today.
Professor Manfletti, you were nominated the very first president of Portugal Space. What is the startup phase of a national space agency like? What was the biggest challenge or hurdle in convincing a country to invest so heavily in their future in space?
Well, look, I think that the first challenge to setting up a space agency is actually the will to support space activities. And behind that, of course, is the recognition that space activities are important, both from a societal point of view, from a national sovereignty point of view, but also from an economic point of view. And back when I was in Portugal, these recognition and this willingness was in place. So the Portuguese government had recognized space as a sector in and of its own that could bring an important contribution to the country, as I said, both from a scientific and technical point of view, but also from a societal and economic point of view. Now, once that is the biggest step, right? And then afterwards, you go into obviously all the legal aspects which are associated with setting up a new organization at government level. So obviously, you need a law to be put in place, which requires, of course, support across the various parts of government. And then once that has happened, of course, you have to set up the agency itself, which is an organism, which then requires the right people. So finding the right talent, right, finding the right people that understand that their role is to act as business developers for the sector, right? Because an agency doesn't build, an agency doesn't do technology, an agency fosters, right? An agency invests into local industry. And does so also in collaboration with other countries in order to, as I said, act as a business development, as a growth, a catalyst for the growth of the ecosystem. I have to say that I very, very much loved the time in Portugal, because when you're in the early stages, I was interacting with the minister at the time on a daily basis. We had new ideas and we were implementing them very, very quickly. So when you talk about challenges, I have to say I only think of very, very nice moments when we were really creating innovation across the country. at a daily pace. At the time, if I may add just a couple more elements, of course, it very much depends also on the country that you're in, right? And Portugal is a country that had invested in space for 20 years, but hadn't yet, let's say, grown a global champion in any field, right? If you're a country that doesn't have that much financial availability, then of course the big question is, how can I, with little financial availability, make a huge impact? And there you have two ways of doing it. One is you say you see yourself as a thought leader, right? So you bring the thought, you bring the idea, and somebody else brings the money. And the second option is, of course, is to invest in the future. Invest in those things that nobody's looking at yet, where there's no competition, where you don't already have established global champions. And that's basically the strategy that we put in place, looking at priorities from a national point of view. Portugal is a country which is located at the borders of the Atlantic. It's responsible for an enormous part of the Atlantic. So focusing on protecting the Atlantic, leveraging its economic power, making sure that the seas are also safe was an important element. But then there was the element of what other sectors, other markets will the space sector unlock in the future? And space safety was one of them, for example, just to give an example.
Professor Manfletti, I want to ask a question that is a little bit out of script, but why do you think countries should invest so heavily on space? What are the benefits of investing in space?
Well, for a country, as I said, I think that there's various dimensions. One is, of course, providing societal benefit to its people, but then there's a whole economic dimension. Just to give you an idea, you're obviously sitting in Venezuela. I don't have the numbers. I could have looked up the numbers for Venezuela, forgive me. But in Europe, for example, 20% of the economic sector that's European is dependent on space-based services. So information that comes from Galileo, which is position, navigation, and timing, services that come from Earth observation, so imaging of the surface of the Earth and extracting intelligence regarding, for example, precision farming. So how do I optimize my crop output? But there's many other elements. And then there's obviously the whole national sovereignty aspect, right? How do I protect my critical infrastructure, and space and satellites also themselves being obviously a critical infrastructure? Today, we cannot imagine a world without space. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, and I don't know if your listeners are aware, but even banking transactions use information that comes from atomic clocks, which are located in space, so that they can precisely time those transactions from happening. And there's lots of money that's dependent on that.
At the European Space Agency, you were a program advisor to the Director General. In a room full of different countries with different goals, how do you find a sort of single vision for Europe's future in space?
Okay, so I know this is a YouTube channel, so I always, when I tell this story, I always say don't disclose it to too many people, but that's not going to be the case here. So I always say that when you're working in intergovernmental organization with so many countries and so many actors, it's like a family with 20, 30 children trying to agree where you want to go on holiday. It's a very difficult task. On the other hand, it's sometimes also easy to find like-minded countries that have similar interests, similar goals. And different countries also have different technologies that they're very good at, right? So all of a sudden you can create more from bringing different players together, right? So bringing different countries together, you can create big missions that otherwise a single country would not enable. And that's where you can really do magic, right? Because all of a sudden it's not just about putting financials together and financial capabilities together. It's about developing new technologies, new capabilities based on the strengths that each and every player can bring together. And for me, that's where the magic happens. So despite it being very complex in certain ways, it's also wonderful because you bring all of these different capabilities and also different ways of thinking together, which is really great.